Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies.
Song. Fleetwood Mac, right? Yeah, we're talking about, I guess, fraud. A great song lead in here for The Law Show here on CL 650. And we have Joe Murphy, QC from Murphy-Battista in downtown Vancouver. And from their Kelowna office, we have Bill Dick joining us in studio. Now, we've been talking about fraud in the ICBC campaign, and we've heard it on the radio and TV and newspapers and what have you. So you must have some great anecdotes, firsthand stories of, we've basically framed this saying, you don't believe it is a runaway problem, but there is fraud in the system. So what kind of things do people do, and how do they get caught? Because I think the getting caught is, they don't catch the smart ones, right? These people make pretty silly mistakes trying to outwit the government and outwit police, right?
Well, they do, but usually, like if you talk to a policeman, Zach, they'll tell you most criminals are pretty stupid.
That's what I'm saying. They don't catch the smart ones.
Yeah, well, there are, and over the course of ICBC's 30, 40 years, 40-plus years of operation, they've figured things out, and they've closed the door. Years ago, if my car was vandalized and it was totaled out, I could keep the car. Mm-hmm. So you get some exotic, well, even some import cars. A Volkswagen Scirocco, if you take the steering wheel and the two front seats out, that would total the car because they were like $15,000 to replace. Mm-hmm. So
the parts alone.
Yeah. So some guy would phone and report his car stolen. It'd be recovered without the steering wheel, without the seats. ICBC would pay him out. He'd keep the salvage, and then somehow he was able to locate a steering wheel in the seats. So the car was back on the road, and he had money in his pocket and a free car. There were people who would take turns running into one another.
That's the one I remember. There was there was a whole ring of people. They're all banging into each other. Then they would go to the chiropractor, and the chiropractor was in on it, the doctor, and it was this whole ring.
Well, there was actually a video of it, and car number one rear-ended car number two, and they got out and looked at the damage. They decided there wasn't enough damage, so they actually ran it into the car again. Then they got out and thought, okay, that's enough. And I remember I was at the courthouse one time, and I was talking to a lawyer who did a lot of ICBC work, and he had a fellow who was claiming injury who had 17 other pending claims.
Wow.
So a bit of a sign.
He's very unlucky, I guess.
A bit of a sign.
He gets been rear-ended all of these times.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Let's have a target on his back.
Yeah, so there's that. There's people who are in an accident, claim they can't work, and in fact continue working. But the reality is ICBC catches most of these people because they're not going to pay out money on a claim unless the evidence is solid, showing that there is a loss, that there is an injury, that there is an income loss. ICBC commonly hires investigators to go around and film people. They sometimes spend tens of thousands of dollars on investigators to film someone in the hope that they'll get them doing something that they say they can't do.
And in terms of ICBC and its vast resources, oftentimes in accidents, they'll hire independent adjusters who will go out and they'll interview people, or they have their own special investigation unit, their fraud unit. So they have been aware for years and years and years that there is fraud in the system, and they've spent a fair bit of their own money to investigate these things right from the outset, and they catch, I'd say, the vast majority of people who do it.
And they also must have seen these schemes before. So here's this one again, right?
Yeah.
And
well,
that happens.
True. Well, Zach, I'll give you another example of fraud because it was a case of mine. I acted for a young fellow who had quite a significant brain injury from an accident. And the accident happened in the Kootenays, and ICBC sent an investigator out to get witnesses for the trial, and the trial was held some years after the accident. And they got some local witnesses who were prepared to come to court and really say this kid who was injured was a phony and he was a bullshitter. And when we got on the trial, the witness gets on the stand, I said to this witness, "What did that investigator tell you about this fellow making the claim?" And after a while it came out, well, the investigator said that my client was trying to claim that he was paralyzed. Mm-hmm. Well, my client was never paralyzed. He had a brain injury, not a spinal cord injury. But here was the investigator who was feeding wrong information to the witnesses to try and get them worked up so that they would come to court and say bad things about the client. So is that fraud? Is what the investigator did fraud? If you use the ICBC advertising campaign, that's fraud.
And is that their investigator?
That was the ICBC investigator. And there was a whole bunch of different people he spoke to, and the information that came from these people they called as witnesses showed that they had been misled, you could say lied to, by the investigator who was trying to get them to come to court and say bad things about my client. But my client was never paralyzed. He never said he was paralyzed.
I have an interesting story. I lived when I first started in this business, I lived in an apartment block, and there was this fellow who lived on the main floor with his mother, and he had a distinct walk, a pronounced lip and a sort of a cupped hand, and he looked quite disabled. And as the years went by, I found out that he had been in an accident. And so I guess some people maybe are willing to put up a show for a long period of time, because this is firsthand information. I've seen it with my own eyes. He went through the whole process for years and finally got a settlement, lived with his mom, and then miraculously within a year he was out doing taekwondo in the courtyard, and over several months the limp went away, his cupped hand went away. He went back to being a normal, active citizen. So I can't put two and two together, but I can see that there is something going on there.
Well, Zach, I've been practicing 40 years, and in the 40 years, I've had one client who tried to fake a brain injury to the point where he was sitting literally drooling in his lap all day long. And I think at the end of the day, the whole thing was put on. He was in a rest home. He was in a hospital, an extended care ward. He had been in a concentration camp during the Second World War, so it may have been what he was putting himself through was nothing compared to that. But that was the one in 40 years, and that was one where he was picked up. The fraud was picked up on the eve of trial, and the case was settled for peanuts, which is what it was worth. And so that's my experience. One.
Well, I recall as a young lawyer, the managing partner of my firm, this kind of imposing figure, asked me to take this new file, and it was involved a guy who had referred a lot of work to the firm and had a couple of claims that pre-existed my involvement with him. And I looked at his claims, and he'd had a number of injuries before. And I met with him, and he was alleging a knee injury and a couple of other injuries. And I asked him, I said, well, have you ever had any of these injuries before? And he goes, oh, no, I've never had it. I've always been healthy all my life. I've never had these injuries. And I'm like, I just read all about them. And I didn't say that to him. And I went to the managing partner of my firm. I said, I'm not going to represent this guy. And he looked at me, and it was some kind of shock and horror. He goes, what do you mean? I said, I'm not going to be an instrument for this man's fraud. And I told him why, and I walked away. And I thought I was going to get fired. I actually honestly did. And we have, as lawyers, we have ethical duties not to put forward people who are fraudulent or vexatious in their claims. The next morning, he brought me into his office, and I thought, I'm going to get fired.
Right.
And he actually said to me, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. And he said, you're right. We shouldn't be representing people like him.
So
and,
so your firm fired him.
Yeah, effectively we wouldn't represent him because we, even though it meant financially we weren't going to get those referrals anymore from him. But he was clearly, in my mind, clearly not being an honest guy, and I didn't want to represent him.
Have you had clients come in, Joe, where you said no thanks but no thanks?
Yeah, I've developed a sense over
Spidey sense
40
kinda,
years
yeah.
that in some initial interviews I just identified them as a claim that doesn't make sense. Doesn't fly. I had one client who came in 3 months post-accident. He said, I've got a head injury, and he had a binder of materials he'd put together to confirm that he had a head injury. Well, people with head injuries, number one, don't sort of realize that early on, and the last thing they do is put a binder together. So I just said to him, I can't help you. Mm-hmm. We have so many legitimate clients that the last thing we want to do is waste our time with someone who's a phony. Why we wouldn't do that? I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and I'm not saying there aren't people that we have acted for where we get into a case and find out they are exaggerating, they are lying, and we sit them down. I had one, a very, very nice woman, where on the eve of trial, ICBC's film of her showed her doing everything she said she couldn't do. And I said to her, I said, we're not going to court. I'm not going to court with you. And what I hope to do is settle the case, but it's going to be based upon what's really wrong with you. And that was disappointing that she had lied to me so much. But again, that's sort of one in 40 years, 1 or 2 or 3 in 40 years.
Yeah.
But in the first interview, you can usually pick that up, and we just say no thanks.
I did the defense side, and again, part of the job of the defense is to try to ascertain whether the person is fraudulent or not. And we have all these resources. And just one story, years ago, a woman was driving along and she got sideswiped by a vehicle, got out, a popsicle was still in her hand, and said she was fine. She went to the police, reported that she was fine, went home, and the next day reported that she was in significant pain, which sometimes that can happen. And I was defending the claim, and I had some information, and I asked her a bunch of questions, and she was an avid horseback rider, and she said, I never got on my horse after that. It would be like someone was jabbing a screwdriver into my neck. I couldn't possibly do that. After that examination for discovery, I sent to plaintiff's counsel all the videotape that we had of her doing a commercial for Tim Hortons Donuts 2 weeks after the accident, where she was on horseback, and it was all about they had built a hitching post for a bunch of riders in Squamish, and they filmed her up in the mountains galloping.
No problem. Yeah.
No problem. And at the end, she had the option of going back down the truck or riding the 3 or 4 hours down the hill, and she chose the 3 or 4 hours down the hill. So that was a claim that went away. And what ICBC is suggesting is that, you know, the vast majority of people exaggerate their claims. They don't.
And get away with it.
And get away with it. And they don't. In my experience, almost all of my clients, and it's not because I have a halo on, and all my clients do as well, are absolutely have legitimate injuries. The problem is when you have soft tissue injuries or injuries you can't see, and people are in pain, and there's no way to verify it objectively. Those are the things that go to trial, because
and that's the system that you're suggesting, Joe. Is that's the 1%.
Yep.
That's the litmus test in court, right?
And if ICBC wants, they can have a jury on the case. So you get 8 people. They're all premium payers. They get to decide what's fair. So the idea that there's a windfall and that these scoundrels get away with it and they're costing hundreds of millions of dollars, it just doesn't make any sense. One of the things, Zach, that's different today than 20 years ago is the Internet.
Mm-hmm.
The Internet is a tremendous source of information if you know how to use it. And I acted for a woman, a young female professional, who was injured in an accident, and she had been very active before. She described being very inactive since the accident because of the pain, and she was asked at an examination for discovery about her activity level, specifically her running before and her running since, and claimed to have done lots before and almost nothing since because of the pain. And after the discovery, the defense counsel sent me a list of her times in the marathons and half marathons she'd run within 2 years of the accident.
No difference.
Well, the fact that she could run them.
I guess you're right. Yes.
I didn't look at whether her time was better or
my
worse.
time is down 5 minutes.
But, you know, she lied about it. And when they sent that, I met with her, and I was upset because I don't need to waste my time with people that are lying to me.
Right.
But again, that was picked up, it was caught, and the amount that she was paid was probably less than what she would have normally got had she not tried to hide that. But the system's there, the Internet's there, and it's, as I say, it's a valuable source of information.
All right, we're talking about personal injury, ICBC, fraudulent claims against the Crown Corporation, and also we're going to get into MSP costs and ICBC funneling money towards that. We have Joe Murphy from MurphyBattista, QC from downtown Vancouver, and Bill Dick from the Kelowna office joining us in studio, and we'll continue on The Law Show next.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.